Welcome to Learn Create Sew. Today I'm going to show you how to install a centered zipper on a seam. This is a quick, easy zipper application that can be used for a lot of different projects. It works great for dresses and skirts, as well as home decor items like pillows. For years I thought I knew how to correctly install a zipper. However, I always had this ugly back stitching next to the zipper pull, and my zipper always seemed to be off center. Then I finally learned the correct way to do it. So today I'm going to show you how to install this zipper so that it works the first time. I'm also going to show you how to keep your seams nice and straight and to avoid messy back stitching around the zipper pull. To make my zipper sample, I have 2 rectangles of cotton fabric. These rectangles measure 4 1/4 by 7.5 inches, and I have one 5-inch zipper. This is a nylon coil zipper. To begin, let's sew a seam. I'm going to take my 2 rectangles of fabric and place them right sides together. And I'm going to sew a seam along one edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. However, I'm going to use 2 different stitch lengths. The upper section of the seam allowance, I'm going to use a basting stitch. This is a stitch length of 5. That way it can be removed later so the zipper can open. On the lower section, I'm going to sew with a stitch length of 2.5 because that section will stay closed on the seam. Most patterns will have a dot or a marking for where that transition between the stitches is. Since I'm just making a sample today, my fabric doesn't have that. Although if you visit my website, I will have a pattern that you can use that shows you where that transition mark would be. To help me determine where I want the opening for my zipper to end, I'm going to take my zipper and lay it on top of my fabric. I want to make sure that my zipper is a little bit down from the edge. For most zipper applications, you need extra space at the top for seam allowances. This is usually room to add a facing or waistband. I usually like to place my zipper so that the metal zipper stops at the top are about 7/8 of an inch from the top edge of the fabric. Then, when I choose where the opening is going to end, I find the location of the bottom zipper stop and I will go up a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. That way this metal stop will be out of my way when I'm sewing. So I'm just going to mark the placement of that. Because I do usually end my zipper above where the actual zipper stops, I usually buy a zipper that's just a little bit longer than what I need. And now I'm going to sew the seam. The top section of the seam, above my mark, I'm going to use stitch length 5.0. The bottom section of my seam, I'm going to use stitch length 2.5. So I'm going to begin at the top and sew down. And when I get to my mark, I'm going to change my stitch length to 2.5, do a little back stitch, keep sewing, and back stitch again. So let's head to the sewing machine. I'm starting with stitch length 5.0. And now that I've reached my mark, I'm going to switch to 2.5 and do a little back stitch and keep sewing. Now I'm going to press my seam flat and press the seam open. If you plan to use this zipper in a piece of clothing, it's also a good idea to finish the seam allowance. So I'm going to head to my serger and finish the edges here. I'm not going to trim anything off, I'm just going to stitch over the edge. And press the seam again. And now let's mark our sew line. To do so, take note of where your transition was, where you changed stitches. Mine was right here. So I'm going to put a pin there to mark my spot, and I'm going to turn my fabric over to the right side and mark that spot on the front as well. I'm using an air erase marker, so this will vanish, so I don't have to worry about seeing it on my final project. Remove the pin, and now let's draw where we're going to sew. I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on each side of my seam. So I'm going to take my marking tool and my ruler, and I'm going to mark from the top down to where my stitches change, 1/4 of an inch to the right of the seam. And then I'm also going to mark the same to the left of the seam. And I'm going to connect the two at the bottom. And I'm going to make sure that this is a right angle and perpendicular to my seam. I now have a nice guideline for where I'm going to sew my zipper. I'm going to turn my fabric back over so I'm looking at the wrong side. I'm going to take my zipper and place it right side down along the seam allowance. Just as before, I'm going to place it so that the metal stops are 7/8 of an inch from the top edge. I'm also going to make sure that the zipper teeth align with my seam. And I'm going to use a couple pins to hold it in place for a moment. I don't want the pins to be in the way when I actually sew the zipper in place, so I'm going to hand baste the zipper with a needle and thread. When I do this step, I like to use contrasting threads, something that I can easily see and take out later. It's tempting to skip this step, but it really only takes a minute and it does help with the construction of the zipper. I'm going to use big stitches and I'm just going to stitch around the edge. When I get to the top part here, I'm going to make sure that the zipper tape meets at the center. You can see the basting stitches all around the edge. And you'll notice when you look at the front side that the basting stitches are not on my drawn line. That's what you want. You don't want them to be in the way of where you're actually going to sew your zipper in place. Now I basted the zipper in place so that I can sew from the right side. So I'm going to head to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch exactly on my drawn line, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 2.5, and I'm going to make sure that my zipper foot is on my machine. As you do this step, you may also want a sewing stiletto or a sewing tool to help you make sure that the zipper pull is out of the way. I'm going to line up my needle with my mark, and I'm going to sew exactly on the line, but right here under the fabric is my zipper pull, and I do not want to hit that. So I'm going to use my purple thing to gently push it out of the way when I sew, so that I don't have to worry about hitting that. When you get to the bottom, needle down, turn, and here's my zipper pull again. So I'm going to gently push it out of the way. Make sure it's not in the path of my stitch line, and keep sewing. Remove the hand basting stitches. And remove the basting stitches from your center seam. These were the stitches with length 5.0. And our zipper's finished. Want to keep your zipper sample so that you can refer to it again later? You can visit my website for a free template and written instructions on how to install this zipper. Then keep your sample as a reference and refer back to it later when you need to remember how to do this skill. You can create your own sewing sample dictionary. If I plan to keep my sample for a while, I like to pink the edges. This is optional, but I do find it helps it stay nice for a long time. You can either use a scalloped rotary cutter or pinking shears to do this. So I've printed off the instructions and template for the centered zipper on the seam, and I've completed my sample and trimmed the edges. You can use either stapler or double-sided tape to hold this into position. I'm going to use some double-sided tape, and I'm only going to do so at the top so that I can look at the sample again later. If you'd also like to add to your dictionary zipper details, that's available for you as well.